What parts of technique are universal across all styles? I had a discussion on my channel the other day about this topic, and I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video about it, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion regarding what parts of your singing are stylistic in nature and what parts of your singing are technical in nature. So I typically focus 99% of the time on technique. And the reason that is because, frankly, technique is harder to get good at. It's harder to master. It takes more time. It's the bedrock of what you do. It's the foundations of what you do. It's the basics. It's the fundamentals. Style is the decoration. Yeah? So I typically focus on technique because, frankly, I can appeal to a broader range of singers, and I can help everyone to some degree, at least everyone that's struggling as a singer. And it's just more interesting to me. I like this idea of getting good at the fundamentals. I like this idea of building and developing a skill set as a singer, and that is where, that's all on the technical side of what you're doing typically. So we're going to just make a couple of broad strokes and define technique and style as simply as we can. So number one, technique is how you create the sound. And number two, style is how you shape the sound. That's a good way to distinguish in your mind between what's what. So when you're shaping and kind of molding the sound, that could be looked at largely as stylistic in a lot of ways. Not all the time, but in a lot of cases. And if you're focusing on how you create the sound, then that is going to be more towards the technical. Now, I will say that there's overlap. Certain parts of style will move into technical work. Certain parts of technique will move into stylistic work. So there's not a black and white. There is a grey area, but we can broadly speak about one and the other pretty clearly most of the time. So universal technique. What parts of technique can we define as universal across all styles? So the first one, and I talk about this all the time, is efficiency. Using the right muscles in isolation and independently, relaxing all the other muscles. Yeah, so if you look at the short little science videos I did recently, I spoke about the wrong muscles that we the bad kind of tension that we want to avoid and eliminate in our technique, and the good kind of tension, as in the correct muscles, the internal muscles in the larynx working correctly and efficiently, and learning to use those independently of one another. Other things like I talk about separating out muscle groups, these kinds of issues that we talk about all the time, or I talk about. You don't hear other coaches talking about it, but I'll talk about them. These kinds of things are universal across all styles. So just to rewind a little bit, I wanted to also mention that the thing about technique is that if you have good technique, you can adapt it and mold it stylistically really relatively quickly and easily. However, if you've got poor technique, no matter what you do to try and mold and shape it stylistically, it's never really going to click and connect with an audience particularly well, because the foundations aren't correct. Yeah. Anyway, let's go back to the universal technique across styles. So I talked about efficiency, using the right muscles, relaxing the wrong muscles, this kind of thing. This is universal. All the good singers, all the professional level singers that are earning a living, generally speaking, are in the upper echelons in terms of their ability to coordinate the right muscles well, relax everything else. Range is another example. So vertical and horizontal range. So vertical being pitch and your ability to move up and down easily and freely, and horizontal range is your ability to work on different levels of compression up and down your range. Yeah, so I think about two types of range. Some singers are better at one than the other. Some singers have very good vertical range, as in they've got a lot of pitch, but they don't have particularly good horizontal range, so they haven't got different types of sounds they can take up and down their range. And sorry to keep bashing, but Ken Tamplin's a good example of this. Great vertical range, but on the horizontal, not much diversity, not much wiggle room, so to speak. Conversely, we also get singers with good horizontal range that don't necessarily sing up to the stratosphere all the time or particularly easily, but some good examples of that would be Matthew Perryman-Jones, Laura Marling, and also potentially Tom York, though he does sing high, but typically he lives in the mid-range, and he's got a very broad palette in terms of the types of sounds that he's comfortable making. The other thing that's universal across all techniques is clutter in the voice, or things that are kind of in the way, or just parts of the technique that aren't quite together and are kind of putting a bit of a wall up or a filter up between the singer and the listener. So things like, we're going kind of quite specific technical things now, but things like the inability to maintain consistent compression across different vowels. So a singer might be able to maintain good consistent closure, but when they open their mouth to certain vowels, the chords might come apart a little bit, or conversely, when they narrow the vowels, sometimes the opposite happens. They tend to squeeze the compression a little bit. So uneven compression through vowel shifts, basically, I guess would be a way to explain it. This is one thing I would call that can potentially get in the way and cause some clutter and problems with the voice. Face and neck tension. Now this goes back to the efficiency, but when I'm talking about efficiency in terms of the muscles in here, inefficiencies, these muscles the swallowing muscles and things like this can actually directly affect the sound, whereas face muscles don't really directly impact the sound, but they do prevent the singer from getting really focused and isolating and helping them to isolate the right muscles. So the more other muscles we have involved in the process of singing, the less the singer is able to isolate the right ones. So the more we can get rid of these muscles, even if they're not directly inhibiting the sound. You notice I can talk like this, and often I sing like that. Some of my videos, I'm not saying that I am the best example of this, but the idea is in our training and our technical work outside of performance, we work towards getting it all relaxed and everything that's needed to be very isolated. There's a certain amount of give and take with technique, obviously. When we go out to perform on stage, we're going to use our technique and let our technique speak for itself, but we also want to get the song across, we want to emote, we want to get involved. So, there's a certain amount of compromise sometimes in what we're doing when we're performing. Nerves get in the way also, this can be a problem. So we can't ever expect 100% efficient technique all the time, especially during performance, but within our practice we can always work towards that. Right, let's go back to this clutter in the voice. So scooping up notes, sometimes this can be used as a crutch, and it can sound like clutter in the voice. So if I'm going for a mum 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 mum, sometimes you get singers that constantly scoop because they can find that free spot and get up to the free spot from the bottom, but they can't find that free spot straight away from the top. This is when they're in the intermediate stages of learning to sing. Another thing you could talk about would be singers who can't connect without help. So, for example, if they're saying a word like go, they'll be fine because the G helps them find connection. If they're having to sing a word like hey, they're going to have a really difficult time because gives you nothing to hold on to, or take, again. There's no voice in the consonant, so it's air first, and then you have to find the compression or closure without any help. So some singers, again, in the intermediate stage, they have to always find compression to get the vowels. So to get the vowels. So some things they do tend to some words they're pronouncing tend to sound a bit off. Things like this. These are like little kind of small details, but you get the idea. Things that we've got in our technique and our voice that are kind of putting a bit of a filter up, inhibiting the nice, clean, clear communication between the listener and the singer. Basically, the less that's in the way between you and the audience, the more that you're going to connect with the audience, the more you're going to draw them in, the more that they're going to feel calm and comfortable listening to you. Right, so style, how we shape the sound. Now, I talked about crossover, but let's just delve into that a little bit more. So some styles obviously need more technique than others to some degree. So metal and rock typically require more vertical range than your singer-songwriter type of style, or country would need typically a very clutter-free type of sound. So there are certain styles which do lend themselves technically one way or the other, or some styles will be more easily kind of taken on by a singer because technically they've got a certain type, the technique that they've developed leans into a different style more or less easily. But if they've got very efficient technique, no clutter in the voice, good horizontal range, good vertical range, they're much more easily able to adapt to different styles. However, if they're less developed as a singer technically, it may be that some styles appeal to them more purely on the basis that the technique that they've developed is angled one way or the other more. So let's talk about things that would determine style, or things that you would work on stylistically if you were trying to be this type of singer or that type of singer. So let's take country as an example. Country leans more towards brighter, more nasal vowels, and typically a very balanced, even amount of compression. It's also a very clutter-free style, so you can't afford to have any stuff in the way with country. Pop, typically more central on the vowels, so more balanced vowels, not necessarily very dark or very bright or very nasal, more in the middle. And typically with pop, and I'm including things like R&B when I say pop, there will be more diversity on the horizontal range, so there'll be more variation in the amounts of compression that singers will use in pop typically. Classical, as a third example, resonance and vowels typically a little bit darker, typically a bit more out of the mouth, and they typically will specialize in one type of compression. So tenors will be full voice, so a fully closed level of compression through the range. Countertenors will be a legit sound, so on the edges of the chords, or a heady type of sound, less compression, however you want to describe it. They're using that throughout their range. Sopranos would be the same. Most female classical singers would be the same. Using those three examples, you can see how there is definitely some technical parts to style. Like I said, no clutter in country. And let's just cover metal and rock. They will again have, I would say, probably more towards brighter, more nasal vowels a little bit. Those depends. Sometimes they are more balanced. And obviously there's more focus on the vertical range and probably less focus on the horizontal range than you would get in other styles typically. Also with rock and metal, I would say you can probably get away with a little bit more clutter in the sound than you can with some other styles. Because typically with rock and metal they're focusing more on the macro, so the broader strokes of singing, the large range, the screams and the wails, rather than the details in the mid-range, which you would have to be obviously getting very good at if you're a country singer or a pop singer typically, because either you don't have the really good vertical range, or the style just doesn't call for it. So your skill set, so to speak, will be developed a little bit differently depending on that style. Again though, if you've got everything developed, you can angle it any way you like. So I guess, let me just go up to what I wrote at the end here. Other variables as well. So there are other stylistic variables you can think about, like for example in R&B they have more melisma, more kind of melodic variation, little trills and runs and things like that. And that's definitely something that you typically will get more in pop music than other styles. Sometimes a little bit in rock and metal as well. whereas a style like country, for example, very clean, clear, concise melodic lines, typically less melisma, when I say melisma, thinking about singers like Mariah Carey, who are the most extreme examples, that type of singing is generally less fashionable these days. So a singer like Adele will be doing a lot less of that. If you notice, stylistically, she's a lot more clean and even, a lot less. I guess you could call it showing off, but a lot less melodic variation. She tends to stick to the melody, and she does it very well. So what we're looking at stylistically is that as time goes on, styles can adapt and change a little bit. The focus of what's important for a singer to have and develop can change. But broadly speaking, the things I covered when I'm talking about style will generally hold true and have done for quite a long period of time. So what I've tried to get really across in this video is this idea that you've got to try and separate out technique and style in your head. And like I said, and like I've kind of explained here and there in this video, there's definitely a grey area there. There's parts of technique that will lend themselves to different styles, and other parts of technique that will lend themselves to other styles. But more broadly speaking, if you master your fundamentals, if you've got good vertical and horizontal range, you've got no clutter in the sound, you've got a very efficient sound, yeah? All of these things lend themselves to singing any style more easily. And conversely, if you've got a lot of clutter in your voice, you've got very little vertical and horizontal range, you've got a real big mess in here in terms of using the wrong muscles, a lot of push, a lot of strain, you're not going to be, it doesn't matter what you do stylistically, you're going to find singing hard, yeah? And it's not going to connect with people. So this should give you a broader understanding of what I'm talking about when I'm saying I only really teach technique. I teach the fundamentals, and this is the reason X, Y, Z, Y. I think I got most of the stuff I wanted to get across in this video, so hopefully, yeah, leave some comments, leave some questions if I've missed anything, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.